So picture this. It's early 1862.
Okay.
Halfway across the world, from the bloody, just completely chaotic battlefields of Virginia, there's a man sitting in a cramped, smoky room in London.
Right.
And he's poring over a map of the United States. And, while the greatest military minds in Washington are sort of flailing, they're paralyzed by political indecision, logistics, this man traces a finger down to the state of Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
And he writes a dispatch basically predicting that if the Union Army wants to break the back of the Confederacy, they shouldn't just squeeze the borders. They need to drive a stake straight through Georgia and cut the South in two.
Which is incredibly prophetic.
Exactly, because that man was Karl Marx. And this is nearly 3 years before General William Tecumseh Sherman actually executed his famous March to the Sea and, effectively won the war.
Mm-hmm.
Marx and his collaborator, Friedrich Engels, had already mapped out the winning strategy from a desk in England.
It's amazing. I mean, we often think of Marx and Engels strictly as the architects of socialist theory, right? Like buried in abstract economic philosophy.
Yeah, definitely.
But we forget that they were actively working as international journalists. During the 1860s, they were writing hundreds of dispatches, mostly for the New York Daily Tribune and also the Vienna newspaper Die Presse.
Right.
And they were analyzing the American Civil War in real time.
Which brings us to the stack of sources we're diving into today. This deep dive is based on excerpts from the Marx and Engels collected works, specifically focusing on their writings about the American Civil War.
And it is a fascinating read.
It really is. Our mission today is to unpack how they diagnosed this conflict, because they didn't see it merely as a localized constitutional crisis over states' rights.
No, not at all.
They analyzed it as this world-historic, violently inevitable clash between two entirely incompatible economic systems. And they detailed this with just astonishingly prophetic military, economic, and diplomatic insight.
Yeah, so we are going to explore the mechanics of their argument today, like how they connected the dots between, say, soil depletion in the American South to the grand strategy of the Union Army, and then all the way to the textile mills of Lancashire in England and the future of the global labor movement.
It's such a massive scope. Now, before we pull the thread on this, I want to offer a very crucial disclaimer. We're dealing with highly charged historical, economic, and political theories today involving capitalism, slavery, and class struggle.
Very heavy topics.
Exactly. So to you, the listener, I want to be entirely clear. Our role here is to impartially report on the content provided in these specific 19th century sources. We aren't here to, endorse the viewpoints of Marx and Engels, nor are we taking any political sides today.
Right, we're just analyzing the texts.
Exactly. Our job is simply to lay out the blueprints of their thought process so you can understand the mechanics of their historical analysis.
We're basically looking over their shoulders, examining the data they had, and tracing the dialectical logic they used to interpret a world that was quite literally on fire.
So, to understand the global shockwaves of this war, we have to look at how they diagnosed the root cause. And their diagnosis fiercely contradicted the mainstream European press of their day.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you were reading the leading British bourgeois press in the early 1860s papers like The Times or The Economist, you were fed this narrative that the American Civil War was fundamentally a tariff war.
A tariff war.
Yeah. The narrative was that the industrial North wanted high protective tariffs and the agrarian South wanted free trade.
Right, of course.
And so the spin was that the North was aggressively trying to establish political and economic hegemony over a South that simply wanted to govern itself.
A tariff war. Framing it that way sounds incredibly dry, but more importantly, it almost completely erases the human atrocity at the center of the conflict. It makes it sound like a polite squabble over taxation.
Exactly. And that framing was highly convenient for the British ruling class because, Britain relied heavily on Southern cotton for its textile industry. So if the war was merely about trade policies, well, the British government could justify intervening on behalf of the South without appearing to endorse human bondage.
Wow, that's dark.
But Marx systematically dismantled this argument in his dispatches. He insisted, unequivocally, that the conflict was rooted in one thing, and that was the institution of slavery. But he didn't just make a moral argument. He made a deeply structural economic one.
Okay, let's unpack this economic argument.
Yeah.
Because it's not just that the North had free wage labor and the South had slave labor and they didn't like each other, right?
Yeah.
It's almost like trying to run two fundamentally different operating systems on the exact same computer network.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Eventually, they will crash into each other.
Mm-hmm.
But if they've coexisted since the founding of the country, Why did they suddenly crash in 1861?
Mm.
From what the sources outline, the Southern plantation economy was structured in a way where it couldn't sustain itself in a closed loop. The cultivation of short staple cotton, using enslaved labor, rapidly depleted the nitrogen in the soil. So the system required a constant, violent influx of new, virgin land just to keep the current economy from collapsing on itself.
Yeah, that soil exhaustion is a critical factor here. Unlike agricultural practices in certain parts of the North that utilize, say, crop rotation or
Or
fertilizer.
sustainable farming.
Exactly. The Southern model was extractive to the extreme. Once the soil in a state like Virginia or South Carolina was tapped out, the planters had to move west
They just packed up.
into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and eventually Texas. But the necessity for expansion wasn't merely agricultural, it was deeply political.
Because of the balance of power in Washington.
Precisely. The South's political power in the federal government, particularly in the Senate, where each state gets 2 votes, relied entirely on the continuous creation of new slave states.
Okay.
As European immigration swelled the population of the northern free states, the North's dominance in the House of Representatives became insurmountable.
Because that's based on population?
Right. So the South's only defense to protect the institution of slavery at the federal level was to ensure that for every new free state added to the Union, a new slave state was added as well.
So they literally had to grow or die. It's a biological and political imperative. But here's the collision course. At the exact same time, you have this explosive population growth in the Northwest states like Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin.
Right.
The free farmers, the agricultural wage laborers of the North, are also expanding westward. They need that exact same land to establish free homesteads.
And Marx summarized the stakes perfectly here. He wrote that the whole movement was based on whether the vast territories of the Republic would become, quote, nurseries for free states or for slavery.
Wow.
It was an absolute zero-sum game. 2 fundamentally opposed modes of production were racing to occupy the same continental space.
Which brings us to the Mississippi River. The sources place a huge emphasis on the geography of the continent, specifically the Mississippi, as the ultimate choke point.
Oh, yeah. The Mississippi was the superhighway of the 19th century American economy.
Right.
The great agricultural states of the Northwest relied on the Mississippi to transport their grain and goods down to the Gulf of Mexico and out to global markets.
So, if the Southern Slave Republic successfully expanded westward and secured control of the lower reaches of the Mississippi,
The free states of the Northwest would be economically strangled.
because a foreign, completely hostile nation would control their only access to the sea.
Exactly. And Marx argued that if the South pulled that off, the economic interests of those Northwestern states would actually compel them to secede from the North and join the Southern Confederacy just to maintain access to the river.
Wait, really? The sources suggest the Northwest might have joined the Confederacy, not out of ideological sympathy, but sheer economic blackmail.
That was the danger Marx identified. If the South succeeded in its expansion, he warned that the slave system would infect the whole Union.
Wow.
It wasn't just a matter of the South retreating to protect a quaint, isolated way of life. It was an aggressive bid for continental hegemony.
If their entire system is built on infinite expansion, then simply asking them to stay within their current borders wasn't a compromise, it was an economic death sentence.
Right.
Is that why they fired the first shot? Because when we look at secession, there was this widespread notion, even in the North, of, just let them go in peace.
Oh, the peaceful secession myth was very prevalent. When the Southern states began seceding after Abraham Lincoln's election in 1860, many European observers thought the North should avoid bloodshed. Like, why subjugate millions of people who want to form their own government? Just split the country in 2.
It sounds so civilized on paper. A conscious uncoupling. You take your territory, we'll take ours.
But Marx argued this was a catastrophic illusion, precisely because the South wasn't just claiming the states that had already voted to secede. They were claiming the vast, unsettled Western territories, and critically, they were claiming the border states.
The border states are such a fascinating gray area in this early phase of the war. We're talking about Maryland, Virginia, Kentucky, Missouri.
Right. These were the states where the 2 systems physically overlapped. You had enslaved labor and free labor existing side by side. The South claimed these states as rightfully theirs, which meant claiming more than 3/4 of the territory hitherto comprised by the Union.
They weren't hiding their ambitions at all. The sources point to the infamous cornerstone speech by Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy.
Yeah, that speech it's chilling. Stevens explicitly boasted to the world that their new constitution was the first in human history to recognize that the Negro is not equal to the white man.
Just overt white supremacy.
Completely. And that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. He called slavery the very cornerstone of their new state.
So the European press is over there trying to spin this as a polite debate over import taxes, while the vice president of the Confederacy is shouting from the rooftops they are building a new empire dedicated to the expansion and perfection of human bondage.
Exactly. Marx pointed to speeches like that to prove this was a, quote, war of conquest for the spread and perpetuation of slavery. And because the South was actively attempting to conquer the border states and the West, the North could not just let them go. To do so would mean surrendering the continent.
But this geographic reality puts Lincoln in a paralyzing political bind. The North had to fight, but Lincoln was terrified of alienating the loyal slaveholders in those critical border states. I mean, there were slaveholders in Maryland and Kentucky who opposed secession and stayed in the Union.
Right.
So Lincoln's early strategy seemed entirely dictated by the fear that if he moved against the institution of slavery, these border states would defect, taking their resources and strategic geography to the Confederacy.
And Marx and Engels heavily critiqued this early political maneuvering. They argued that this tender regard for border state prejudices completely compromised the North's initial war efforts. The politicians in Washington spent the first year of the war constantly assuring the border states and the world, really, that this was strictly a war to restore the Union, and that they had no intention of interfering with slavery where it already existed.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. By trying to appease these moderate slaveholders, wasn't Lincoln actually fighting with one hand tied behind his back? I have to push back on Lincoln's logic here, even given the political reality of the time.
Go ahead.
You are fighting a war against an enemy whose entire economic and military infrastructure is built on enslaved labor. But you're actively promising not to touch the enslaved labor because you might offend a few moderate slaveholders on your own side.
Yeah.
Like, you're fighting the symptoms, the secession, but you're actively protecting the disease, the slavery.
Yeah, the contradiction was glaring. And it translated directly into military disaster. Marx categorized this early phase of the conflict as the constitutional waging of war.
Constitutional raging of war.
Yes. The North refused to fight a revolutionary war against slavery. They insisted on fighting a constitutional war to preserve the Union exactly as it previously existed, a Union that, paradoxically, protected slavery under its constitution.
Right. How do you fight a constitutional war against an enemy that has torn up the Constitution?
You can't.
And the sources focus intensely on how this political timidness infected the military leadership, specifically Union General George McClellan.
General McClellan is the avatar of this contradictory mindset in Marx and Engels' writings. They viewed McClellan and his cadre of conservative officers as viewing the war in a strictly businesslike fashion.
Businesslike?
Yeah, they wanted to put the country back together through minimal maneuvering without altering the social fabric or affecting matters of principle.
The examples in the dispatches are surreal. The Union Army, ostensibly fighting to suppress a slaveholders' rebellion, was actually ordered to catch runaway slaves and return them to their Confederate masters.
I know, it's mind-boggling. It was a strict adherence to the Fugitive Slave Act, even in a theater of war. And the demoralization this caused among Northern soldiers, many of whom were abolitionists, or at least deeply resented the Southern aristocracy, was profound.
The sources even mentioned McClellan expelling musicians from the army camps because they were singing anti-slavery songs.
Right.
It is a level of ideological blindness that almost guarantees military failure. You cannot fight a polite, limited war against an enemy that views your victory as the annihilation of their entire civilization.
And Marx predicted that this constitutional approach would inevitably lead to the North facing a terrible thrashing. He argued that the Constitution was being used as a pretext to avoid the real material issue at the heart of the conflict.
It's slavery.
Exactly. To win, Marx argued, a war of this kind must be waged along revolutionary lines.
Meaning you have to strike at the root of the enemy's power.
The root of the Confederacy's economic and military power was the enslaved population. They were the ones growing the food, digging the trenches, and keeping the economy running while the white Southern men went off to fight.
Right.
Until the North recognized that and actively sought to dismantle the slave system, they were fighting a phantom.
This brings up a fascinating dynamic in the sources. We have Marx diagnosing the political and economic contradictions, but then we have Friedrich Engels dissecting the actual battlefield tactics.
Yes.
Because Engels had a deep, almost obsessive fascination with military strategy.
He did. Engels was colloquially known among his friends as the General.
The General, I love that.
Yeah. He studied military history, logistics, and tactics relentlessly, and the American Civil War presented him with a theater of war completely without parallel in European history.
The sheer scale of it.
Yeah.
We aren't talking about two professional armies meeting on a small field in Belgium for an afternoon. We're talking about a continent-spanning conflict with massive, improvised armies of civilians operating across thousands of miles.
And Engels was particularly struck by the high technical level of American engineering applied to warfare.
The infrastructure.
Exactly. He noted the unprecedented use of railroads to move entire armies, the use of telegraphs for real-time strategic command, and the deployment of steamboats for complex logistical supply chains along the rivers. He recognized he was watching the birth of modern industrialized warfare.
So Engels is watching this massive industrial war machine spool up in the north, and then he looks at their actual strategy, the infamous Anaconda Plan, and he just tears it apart.
Oh, completely. The Anaconda Plan, which was proposed by the aging General Winfield Scott, envisioned a slow, strangling naval blockade of the southern ports, combined with a gradual, cautious advance down the Mississippi River.
Right.
The stated goal was to squeeze the South into economic submission with minimal actual combat, hoping pro-Union sentiment in the South would eventually force a surrender.
Wait, if the Anaconda Plan is just squeezing the perimeter, that leaves the entire southern interior completely intact. The Confederacy had interior lines of communication.
Yes.
They could just use their own railroads to shuffle troops back and forth to wherever the Union was currently squeezing. Engels must have seen that this would just lead to endless stalemate. Did he suggest they just punch a hole straight through the middle?
He did better than suggested. He mapped it out. Engels argued that the Anaconda Plan was militarily untenable and politically cowardly. In early 1862, he and Marx proposed a radically different strategy in their writings. They looked at the topography and the infrastructure of the South and identified the exact center of gravity.
Georgia.
They argued that the North needed to abandon the slow squeeze, concentrate its forces, and drive a massive wedge straight through to Georgia.
Why is Georgia the keystone, though?
Because Georgia was the vital connecting link of the Confederacy. It connected the Eastern Theater, Virginia, and the Carolinas, where the bulk of the fighting was happening, with the western states like Alabama and Mississippi, which were providing the food and manpower.
I see.
The major railroad arteries of the South intersected in Georgia. If a Union army occupied Georgia, you sever the Confederacy's nervous system. You physically cut their nation in half, making it impossible for them to shift troops or supplies between the East and the West.
Which is exactly what happens, but not in 1862.
Yeah.
It isn't until late 1864 that General Sherman takes Atlanta and begins his march to the sea, destroying the railroads, burning the infrastructure, and effectively breaking the back of the Confederate war effort.
Yep.
Marx and Engels called the winning strategy nearly 3 years before the Union High Command finally implemented it. That is wild.
Their foresight wasn't magic, though. It was the result of dialectical analysis applied to military geography. They understood that you couldn't just defeat Confederate armies in the field in a war of attrition. You had to destroy the material infrastructure that allowed those armies to exist.
But to do that, to unleash a general like Sherman to burn his way through the heartland of the South, the North had to stop fighting a constitutional war. They had to transition to the Second Act. They had to embrace revolutionary measures.
And this transition finally occurs in the latter half of 1862. Lincoln, previously balancing on that political tightrope regarding the border states, was pushed by mounting public pressure, disastrous military defeats in Virginia, and the radical wing of his own Republican Party to take drastic action.
And the sources highlight two massive turning points that represent this shift to a revolutionary war. The most famous, obviously, is the Emancipation Proclamation.
Right. By declaring the enslaved people in the rebellious states to be forever free, Lincoln finally aligned the military goals of the Union with the moral and economic imperative of abolishing slavery.
Yes.
He turned a war for territorial integrity into a war of social liberation.
But the sources emphasize the military utility of this. It wasn't just a moral decree, it authorized the arming of black troops.
And the creation of black regiments was perhaps the most revolutionary act of the entire war.
Really?
Yeah. Marx noted that arming the formerly enslaved would have a, quote, remarkable effect on Southern nerves.
I can imagine.
You are taking the very foundation of the Southern economic system, the subjugated labor force, and literally handing them rifles and putting them in blue uniforms to march back into the South.
Right.
It struck terror into the planter class and fundamentally degraded their ability to wage war as thousands of enslaved people fled the plantations to join the advancing Union lines.
It's the ultimate dialectical flip. The source of their power becomes the instrument of their destruction. But Marx and Engels also point to a second revolutionary measure from 1862 that is less talked about today, the Homestead Act.
Yes. To understand the Homestead Act through a Marxist lens, we have to remember our earlier discussion about the South's imperative to expand. The South needed the Western territories to build massive new cotton plantations.
And what the Homestead Act does is completely disrupt the spatial economics of the West. The U.S. government essentially said, we will give 160 acres of public land to anyone willing to settle it and farm it themselves.
By democratizing land ownership on a massive scale, the Homestead Act flooded the West with free laborers, immigrants, and small-scale farmers.
But how does that actually stop a plantation owner from just buying up the land next door and bringing in enslaved labor?
Because of the infrastructure it generates.
No.
A region dominated by small, independent farmers requires a dense network of towns, schools, and most importantly, railroads.
Right.
A massive plantation economy relies on isolated fiefdoms and access to major rivers to export raw goods. The two physical infrastructures are completely incompatible.
Oh, wow.
By incentivizing hundreds of thousands of free farmers to settle the West, the Homestead Act legally and physically locked the South out. It definitively answered the question of whether the territories would be nurseries for slavery or free labor.
So the Emancipation Proclamation dismantles the slave system from within, and the Homestead Act suffocates its expansion from without. The Union has finally begun fighting a revolutionary war.
They have.
But the shockwaves of this revolution couldn't be contained to the North American continent.
No, the interconnected nature of the 19th century global economy guaranteed that a civil war in America would cause an economic earthquake in Europe.
Let's talk about the global supply chain of the 1860s. We mentioned earlier that the British press framed this as a tariff war because Britain needed cotton. Just how dependent was the British Empire on the American South?
Extremely dependent. The American South was producing the vast majority of the raw cotton that fueled the Industrial Revolution. Cotton was the oil of the 19th century.
Right.
And the textile mills of Lancashire, England, were the engine of the British economy, employing hundreds of thousands of workers.
So when the Union Navy finally gets the Anaconda Plan working, when they successfully blockade the southern ports like New Orleans and Charleston, they choke off the South.
Yes.
But in doing so, they accidentally strangle the British economy.
The blockade triggers a massive economic crisis in Europe known as the Cotton Famine. The supply of raw material completely dries up, the Lancashire mills grind to a halt.
Completely shut down.
Yes. The factory owners face bankruptcy, and the British working class faces unimaginable misery. Hundreds of thousands of textile workers are thrown out of their jobs. We are talking about mass starvation, relying on meager, poor relief just to survive.
This is where the geopolitical chess game gets incredibly tense. How did Marx expect the British ruling class to react to their textile mills shutting down?
The British and French governments, representing the interests of the aristocracy and the industrial bourgeoisie, were desperate to intervene.
Who wanted to step in?
Yeah, they saw a dual opportunity. First, break the northern blockade using the superior Royal Navy, recognize the Confederacy as an independent nation, and get the cheap cotton flowing back to their factories.
And the second opportunity?
Geopolitics. The United States was a rising economic and democratic rival. If the American Republic permanently fractured into two mutually hostile nations, it would no longer threaten European imperial dominance in the Western Hemisphere.
Divide and conquer.
Precisely. The British ruling class was actively looking for a pretext to declare war on the North.
And they almost got one in late 1861 with the Trent Affair. The sources go into detail on this diplomatic crisis.
Oh, the Trent Affair, yes. The Trent was a British mail packet ship. Two Confederate diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell, slipped past the Union blockade and boarded the Trent in Havana, intending to travel to London and Paris to formally request military intervention.
Okay.
A Union warship, commanded by Captain Charles Wilkes, intercepted the Trent in international waters, fired a shot across her bow, boarded the British vessel, and arrested the Confederate diplomats.
I mean, to the British, this looks like an act of war. You have an American ship boarding a neutral British vessel and kidnapping passengers.
Lord Palmerston, the British Prime Minister, utilized the incident to whip the British public into a jingoistic frenzy. The press demanded retaliation for the insult to the British flag.
Right.
The government began preparing the fleet and actually dispatched thousands of troops to Canada, preparing for a land invasion of the northern states.
The Union is already losing battles to the Confederacy, and now the most powerful empire on Earth is massing troops on their northern border.
Yeah.
How does this not spiral into a global war that guarantees a Southern victory?
This is where Marx's journalism becomes truly impassioned. He documented what he considered one of the most heroic acts of political solidarity in modern history. The disaster wasn't ultimately averted by smooth diplomacy. It was averted by the organized resistance of the English working class.
The same working class that is currently starving in the streets of Lancashire because of the Northern blockade.
Exactly. Despite suffering immense economic hardship, despite seeing their own children go hungry because the cotton supply was cut off, the English workers did not demand that their government break the blockade.
So what does this all mean? We have starving workers in England actively protesting against the very thing breaking the blockade that would bring them immediate economic relief. Why?
Because of a profound level of political consciousness. Marx detailed how workers held massive public meetings in London, Manchester, Sheffield, and other industrial centers. Yeah. They drafted resolutions and sent them to the press and to the government, vehemently opposing any intervention on behalf of the slaveholders.
They understood exactly what the Confederacy represented.
They recognized that the American Civil War was not merely a foreign squabble. It was a front line in the global struggle between capital and labor. They understood that a war to perpetuate and expand slavery in America was an attack on the dignity, value, and future of labor everywhere.
If the British Empire allied with the slave empire, it would empower the most reactionary forces on the planet, which would eventually blow back on the British working class.
Right. Marx saw this as a triumph of working-class internationalism. The workers proved capable of acting as an independent political force, guided by a moral and political compass that transcended national borders and even their own immediate, desperate self-interest.
Their protests created so much domestic political pressure that Lord Palmerston's government was forced to back down. Combined with Lincoln's quiet diplomatic decision to eventually release the Confederate envoys, the crisis passed.
Marx wrote that the English working class saved the west of Europe from plunging headlong into an infamous crusade for the perpetuation and propagation of slavery.
The textile workers of Manchester effectively guarded the flank of the Union Army. It is a stunning moment of transatlantic solidarity, and it transitions perfectly into the ultimate conclusion Marx and Engels drew about the historical weight of this war. They used a very specific, highly evocative word to describe the destruction of American slavery. They called it a tocsin.
Yes. A tocsin is an alarm bell. It's a signal sounded in a town square to warn of an emergency or to announce that something momentous, something world-changing is underway.
Marx wrote that just as the American War of Independence sounded the tocsin for the European middle class in the 18th century, the American Civil War sounded it for the European working class in the 19th century.
Let's dig into that parallel.
Yeah, how did the Revolution of 1776 act as an alarm bell for the bourgeoisie?
Well, consider the geopolitical landscape of the late 1700s. Yeah. Europe is entirely dominated by feudal monarchies, entrenched aristocracy, and rigid hereditary class structures.
Sure.
Then, across the Atlantic, these colonies rebel. They throw off the British monarchy and establish a republic explicitly based on Enlightenment ideals, constitutional law, and crucially, bourgeois property rights.
They prove that a nation doesn't need a king to function.
Exactly that. It signaled to the rising middle classes in Europe, the merchants, the early industrialists, the lawyers, that a different world was entirely possible.
Right.
The American Revolution served as a massive catalyst that helped spark the French Revolution and the broader wave of bourgeois democratic revolutions that swept across Europe in the 19th century, sweeping away feudalism.
So if 1776 was the alarm bell that signaled the rise of the bourgeoisie, how does 1861 function as the alarm bell for the working class?
Because Marx and Engels firmly believed that the existence of chattel slavery in the United States was a massive, immovable roadblock to the advancement of the global working class movement. There is a famous quote from Marx's later work, Capital, that was forged during his analysis of the Civil War. He wrote, "Labor in the white skin cannot emancipate itself where labor in the black skin is branded."
Labor in the white skin cannot emancipate itself where labor in the black skin is branded. Let's break down the mechanics of that. Why does the physical enslavement of one demographic group inherently prevent the political and economic emancipation of another, ostensibly free, group?
It comes down to the theory of surplus value and the mechanics of wage depression. As long as the capitalist class has access to a deeply subjugated, enslaved population from which they can extract maximum profit with near zero labor costs,
They will use that incredible leverage to depress the wages and working conditions of all other workers.
exactly. Because why would a northern industrialist pay a high wage to a factory worker if a southern planter is proving that you can generate immense wealth by paying the worker nothing at all? Slavery degrades the very concept of labor. It turns the human being entirely into a commodity. Furthermore, it creates a rigid racial hierarchy that violently divides the working class.
Pitting them against each other.
Yes. As long as poor white workers in the North or the South are taught to view themselves as racially superior to enslaved black workers, they will align with the ruling class rather than recognizing their shared class interests against the ruling class.
So by destroying American slavery, the Civil War wasn't just a localized act of freeing the enslaved black population, though obviously that was the primary material result. Right. From a global Marxist perspective, it was removing a fundamental structural barrier to the progress of labor worldwide.
It was a necessary historical precondition. As long as the slave power existed, the modern struggle between capital and wage labor was distorted, stunted, and confused. The destruction of slavery cleared the air.
But the sources make it clear that Marx and Engels didn't suffer from naive optimism. They didn't view the North's victory at Appomattox as the dawn of a workers' utopia.
No, they were incredibly clear-eyed analysts. Even before the war ended, they foresaw the betrayals of the Reconstruction era. They realized that the American bourgeoisie, the Northern industrialists, railroad tycoons, and Wall Street financiers would eventually compromise with the defeated Southern planters.
Wait, why compromise with the very people who just killed hundreds of thousands of your citizens in a treasonous rebellion?
Because capital craves stability and profit above all else. The Northern capitalists wanted to efficiently exploit the vast natural resources and agricultural output of the conquered South.
Oh, I see.
They quickly found that doing business with the former slaveholders who still owned the land was vastly more profitable than dealing with a newly empowered, enfranchised, and organized black labor force that might demand fair wages and political rights.
So the revolutionary promise of the Emancipation Proclamation is betrayed for the sake of the almighty dollar.
Marx and Engels noted that the financiers in New York who held the mortgages on Southern infrastructure had a vested interest in keeping the Southern workforce marginalized, disorganized, and cheap.
Right.
They foresaw that this compromise would lead to the preservation of racial discrimination and new, insidious forms of social oppression, which manifested as the failure of Reconstruction, the rise of sharecropping, convict leasing, and the brutal regime of Jim Crow laws.
If they knew the post-war reality was going to be that bleak, that the Northern capitalists would essentially sell out the freedmen to the old Southern aristocracy, why did they still view the Civil War as the Tocsin? Why was it still a victory?
Because in historical materialism, you do not leap from a slave society to a socialist utopia in one step. They never viewed the bourgeois democratic republic of the United States as the final goal of history. They viewed it as a cleared battlefield.
A cleared battlefield.
Yes. By violently excising the medieval, pre-capitalist stain of chattel slavery, the Civil War stripped away the illusions. It swept away the archaic social structures that were muddying the waters.
Right.
The conflict created a unified national market, it hyper-accelerated industrialization, and it rapidly expanded the ranks of the industrial proletariat.
So the war didn't bring about the revolution of the working class, but it created the specific material conditions where that revolution could actually be fought on its own unadulterated terms.
Precisely. The end of slavery meant the beginning of the next, and in their view, final phase of historical development. The archaic clash between slave labor and free labor was over. Now, the stage was definitively set for the modern struggle between capital and wage labor. The alarm bell had rung, signaling to the working classes of Europe and America that the true conflict was now before them.
It's an incredibly sweeping, almost dizzying vision of history. To look at the bloody, chaotic slaughter of Shiloh or Antietam, or the political mudslinging in Washington, and to see the deep underlying tectonic plates of global economic history shifting.
It requires a specific analytical lens, one that constantly looks past the political rhetoric of the moment to identify the underlying material realities and class interests driving human events.
Okay, let's bring this all together. We started with a stack of 19th century journalistic dispatches, and we've unpacked a profoundly different way of understanding the American Civil War. We've seen how Marx and Engels debunked the mainstream narrative that it was just a squabble over tariffs or abstract states' rights. They diagnosed it as a violently inevitable collision between two fundamentally incompatible economic systems. The slave-owning South, which was forced by the biological reality of soil depletion to constantly expand, and the free-wage labor North.
And we examined how they correctly identified the South as the aggressor, fighting a war of conquest to spread human bondage across the continent. We explored their harsh critiques of the North's initial hesitant attempts to fight a constitutional war while actively appeasing slaveholders.
Right. We looked at Engels' brilliant military foresight, identifying the geographical necessity of striking through Georgia to break the Confederacy's back long before the Union generals acted on it.
Yeah.
We traced the necessary shift toward a revolutionary war, marked by the Emancipation Proclamation, turning the enslaved population into an engine of Southern destruction, and the Homestead Act physically locking the plantation system out of the West.
We zoomed out to witness the global ripple effect, the catastrophic cotton famine in England, the tense diplomatic crises like the Trent Affair, and the deeply inspiring international solidarity of the English working class, who chose starvation over supporting a war for slavery.
And finally, we explored their ultimate conclusion, that the destruction of slavery was the Tocsin, the alarm bell that cleared the historical battlefield for the modern struggle between capital and labor. It is a masterclass in connecting the structural dots of history, economics, geography, and politics.
It really is. It reminds us that historical events of massive scale are never just about the personalities of the generals or the speeches of the politicians.
Exactly.
They're driven by the deep, often unseen currents of how human beings organize their labor and their resources.
Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you, our listener, to mull over. Marx and Engels looked at a regional civil war in the 1860s, looked past the deafening political rhetoric, and saw the gears of global economic history turning. They identified the fundamental clash of incompatible systems beneath the surface. It makes you wonder. When we look at the major intractable geopolitical conflicts of our own time today, are we just getting distracted by the modern equivalents of the tariffs and states' rights arguments? What fundamentally incompatible economic or technological systems are quietly crashing into each other right now, just beneath the surface of the daily news cycle, waiting for their own revolutionary act to begin?
A vital question, and one that requires exactly this kind of deep structural analysis to answer.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the bigger picture, look for the mechanics beneath the rhetoric, and we'll see you next time.